Angela, you think it's pretty likely that we're going to get this summit?
I do. I think both sides, particularly the U.S., recognize that relations are not working well. Xi and Biden haven't spoken in 7 months, and up until that September call that they had recently. And I think there's a concern on both sides that there's some open channel of communication at the highest levels to avoid any kind of risk of, accidental confrontation. It's clear that the conversations at the lower levels of the government were not working that well. So I think it's a good thing that they're planning some kind of dialogue at the highest level to cover some of these issues.
It seems like, this meeting in Zurich was seen to be quite positive. It's come a long way since these two met in Alaska, of course. But then again, you have Catherine Tai speaking a couple days ago, talking about the shortfalls of this phase one trade deal. And we're expected to hear her meeting with Liu He as well. What does this tell you about the direction of where U.S.-China policy is going? And do you think that it is time for the U.S. to maybe play a more tougher approach?
I think the U.S. is in a very tough position. Both sides are. I mean, the relations are at a low point, as we know. There's been some discussion of potential thawing, but really it's been at very high level issues around climate change. There's been no indication on either side of any substantive concessions on anything, really substantial. But, I think the U.S. is in a tough position. Both sides have a lot of domestic pressure. They're playing to their domestic constituencies. But with respect to the trade announcements by Ambassador Tai, that's not really that surprising. I mean, I think when you look at it, the trade war is not working from the U.S. perspective. Janet Yellen said as much. Decoupling is not happening. The U.S. actually is foreign business. U.S. and business is investing even more in China than it has in the past. And I think there's some discussion, as you saw with Ambassador Tai saying, we're going to talk about recoupling. I think it was interesting, Jake Sullivan's conversations coming out of Zurich talking about more of a responsible competition rather than strategic competition. So I think the U.S. in particular recognizes that they should be making some moves to at least shore up the relations from the point where they've been. But both sides face very significant domestic pressure, especially with U.S. midterm elections coming up. And so we really want to watch for some concrete outcomes of these forthcoming summits, including the APEC summit and G20 as well.
How substantial was that? And I'm glad you brought up how they describe rivalry, right? And the phrasing that they use. It's almost, you're not my, you're my adversary, but you're not my enemy. How important was that change in tone and language for you?
Yeah, I think it's important because I think the very harsh rhetoric that we saw coming out of the last U.S. administration, and that's frankly been continued through this administration. Biden has not upped the ante, but he hasn't quieted the waters either. I think it makes it tough for both sides. And the challenge, of course, is there are long-term structural differences. It's hard to see where there's going to be any substantial concessions, as I mentioned, on key points. But I think the real risk is, as the U.S. is shoring up a strategy that's, defense and diplomatic, and now we see economics and trade, there's a real risk of miscalculation or miscommunication. There's been no platform for formal ongoing communication. I think that's what at least particularly U.S. business has been calling for. The old Clinton era strategic economic dialogue of the past, we have nothing like that now. And so I think any open channel of communication and any change in tone is welcome.
And this is all coming at a time when China is ratcheting up tensions with Taiwan and sending warplanes and droves of it near their area there. I'm just wondering, are we likely to see military tensions escalate, and what exactly could go wrong there?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest risk there is probably accidental confrontation. Making mistakes as both sides are doing, freedom of, from the U.S. side, the freedom of navigation operations, and then the Chinese sorties that we've seen. But I think there's a recognition that could go quite wrong quite quickly. Again, if there's not an open channel of communication to kind of, wind things down if there was some kind of accident or miscommunication. But I think, the U.S. is not looking to aggressively ratchet up anything militarily, but they're walking a very fine line. And we're seeing that with a lot of the statements and also the actions that they've been doing here around Asia. But it's a fine line to walk.